There's loads of videos out there which tell you that you shouldn't buy a house, but a lot of people will say that renting is wasting money. So in a time where house prices are rising, the interest rate is increasing, and the cost of living is also increasing, the question is, should you buy a house or should you rent a house? And as someone who started her property investing journey at the age of 24 and has since bought more property, I wanted to share my thoughts on how to figure out whether you should buy a house or whether you should rent a house. So first, let's address the emotional element of purchasing a house. Depending on where you're from and what generation you're in, you will find that people associate success with home ownership. If you tell someone that you own a house, it's sort of a subtle social indication that you're doing well and you are successful. But if we look at the data now, there is a massive disconnect. The average house price as of January of 2025 in the UK was 300,000, and when you looked at house prices in London, the average amount was 450,000 to 500,000 pounds, but the average salary in the UK sits at roughly £38,000 a year. So if we look at the average excluding London, there is about a 8x difference in people's earnings versus the property pricing, which means that purchasing a house isn't as accessible and as easy as it may have been previously. And then we have to talk about the actual process of buying a home and the cost associated with that. Let's say you wanted to purchase a house for £300,000. Well, the average deposit you would need is 10%, and that takes us to £30,000. But there's other things involved in actually purchasing a home. You will need to pay for solicitors, you'll need to pay stamp duty, you'll need to pay for any furniture and moving costs, and that can amount to a significant amount of money really quickly. And then you need to take into consideration the ongoing cost of actually owning that home. So if you have taken a mortgage, you'll need to make monthly repayments for the duration of your mortgage before the house is actually yours. And the price that you'd pay every month for a mortgage varies. Some people can pay £2,000 in their mortgage, some people can pay £4,000 in the mortgage, other people can pay £1,000 in their mortgage, and it's influenced by the interest rate, how much the house costs, how much you were able to put down as a deposit. The second thing you then need to take into consideration is maintenance. When you live in something, after a while there will be wear and tear. You'll need to replace items like boilers or furniture. You might just want to change the aesthetic of your home and get new furniture. That stuff costs money. In fact, on average, people will spend 1% of their property value every year maintaining it. So if you purchased a house worth £300,000, then you might spend up to £3,000 every single year just keeping your house in tip-top shape if you have the disposable means to. And then, as if that wasn't enough, you need to pay for the bills associated with having a home. So that's things like your council tax, things like utility bills, so that's your gas and your electric, and then all the extra stuff that you need, such as Wi-Fi, home security cameras, etc. So if you are a first-time buyer, by the time you take into consideration all of the different points that I mentioned, you could be spending close to £60,000 when you combine the upfront and ongoing costs of owning your home. Now we're going to switch gears and talk about renting. Renting a property offers flexibility and less responsibilities, and I'm going to list them. So the first thing, if there's any maintenance issues, you don't need to worry about that as a tenant. That is your landlord's responsibility. And so if you needed to replace a boiler or if the television was broken, that wouldn't come out of your pocket. That would be something that your landlord would need to sort out. The second thing to consider, I don't think you can put a monetary value on how beneficial this is, but just the flexibility. When you're renting, you have the flexibility to change accommodation frequently and to move to an entirely different area, and you can move relatively quickly with a lot less hassle. Let's say you were applying for a job abroad and you got it and you weren't expecting to get it. You would just need to let your landlord know that you are terminating your lease, whereas if you owned a home, you'd need to look for either people to live in that home whilst you were away, or you'd need to go through the process of selling a home, and selling a home can take 4 months plus, depending on the position that you're in and how quickly you're able to find someone who will buy the house off you. The third thing to also consider when it comes to renting is you have a lot less upfront costs. Typically speaking, when you're renting in the UK, you'll pay your deposit and you'll pay the first month's rent, and then after that you will just pay your month on a regular basis. That doesn't compare to the long list I listed out previously when purchasing a home and the costs associated with having your home, especially if you are a first-time buyer. And when we look at the data, the average rental price in the UK as of December of 2024 was $1,300. And now I will say that rent in London is a lot higher than $1,300, but when you compare that potentially to a mortgage, you could be saving yourself a significant amount of money and then taking that difference and using it to invest, which can make you a lot more money in the long term depending on what your finance goals are. Now, before I talk about the opportunity cost of buying, one thing that I will say is when you rent, you don't take advantage of the equity appreciation. So in other words, there is a stat out there that says that the value of a house doubles every 12 years. If you're renting / you don't own the home that you're in, you won't be able to benefit from the fact that that property is increasing in value. And to some people, that is really important to them. And so they would be against renting and pro home ownership. One thing that is super important to touch on is the opportunity cost associated with home ownership. And I'm going to put that into a real life scenario. So let's say you wanted to live in London and you found a beautiful flat that cost £400,000 and you had a 10% deposit, so in other words you had £40,000, but then you decided not to buy the house. So rather than buying the house, you put the £40,000 into a global index fund that was returning 7% on average year in, year out. Well, after 30 years you will have £304,000, and of that money only £120,000 would have been from the money that you put in. The difference in that would have been money that you earned from compounding. So that's one arm. And then the second arm of that is, let's say the house that you were thinking of purchasing had a mortgage repayment of £2,000, and like we said, you didn't go for the house, but you instead rented a house for £1,700, and then you thought, you know what, rather than spending the difference of £300, I'm also going to invest that money. So again, let's say you took that £300 a month and you invested in a global index fund. Well, after 30 years you would have more than £350,000. So if we add the £350,000 to the £304,000 that you would have gained from taking a lump sum of your deposit and putting it inside an index fund, you would have after 30 years more than £650,000. Now, if we compare that to you purchasing the home, there's loads of factors that you can't account for. You can't account for the property tax, you can't account for how much that house would have cost you on a yearly basis, and you also can't account for the property value fluctuations that tend to happen just because property value also follows its own cycles, where at times it goes high and then when the market isn't doing too well it can also come down. So now we've already touched on the benefits of renting, such as the flexibility it gives you and the fact that you don't need to worry about the maintenance of the property, but we also need to touch on, I guess, the negative sides of renting, such as the fact that you don't have any equity, and so you won't be able to benefit from the house pricing increasing over a period of time. You don't have as much stability as someone who owns their home, because you could be evicted by the landlord if they choose, although there are laws and things around that to help reduce the likelihood of that happening. And then you've also got the issue of rent increasing. We saw rent prices hike up and they continue to be on the rise due to the law of supply and demand, and the fact that the supply of houses in the UK are a lot less, which means that the demand is driving rental increase, and it could get to a point where rent is equivalent to a mortgage, and therefore it goes back to the whole argument of should you buy or should you rent, depending on your financial position. Another thing to consider with renting is, if you don't actually own a home, you'll need to think about what you want to do in your retirement age, and that is something that people tend not to think about, or they don't worry about because they might be planning to go to a different country for their retirement entirely. In short, I personally don't think there is a right answer on whether you should buy a house or if you should rent. I feel like it depends on your financial situation, your preferences, and what makes sense for you in the moment. But I'd be really interested to hear what you guys think. Should you buy your house or should you rent? Make sure to let me know in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe, and I will see you in my next video. Bye!